Prisons are meant to confine the most dangerous elements of society, but throughout history, some prison moves have been so brutal they defy imagination. Whether orchestrated to crush rebellions, break the human spirit, or eliminate perceived threats, these prison transfers and relocations have left an unforgettable mark on history. From inhumane forced marches to calculated transfers designed for suffering, these moves showcase the darkest extremes of punishment. One of the most infamous prison relocations in history was the March of the 10,000 Prisoners in 1848. After the Hungarian Revolution against Austrian rule, thousands of captured revolutionaries were force-marched from Hungary to Austrian prisons, a journey spanning hundreds of miles. Chained together in harsh weather, many died from exhaustion, disease, and starvation before reaching their final destination. A century later, the Nazi concentration camp transfers became one of history's most horrifying examples of brutal prison moves. As Allied forces advanced in 1944–45, the Nazis attempted to evacuate prisoners from concentration camps to prevent their liberation. Known as death marches, these transfers forced thousands of already starving and weakened prisoners to march for miles in the bitter cold. Those who fell behind were executed on the spot. Tens of thousands perished before reaching their new camps. The Siberian Gulag transfers under Stalin's rule were another horrifying example. Prisoners, often arrested on vague charges of political disloyalty, were crammed into overcrowded train cars with little food or water for weeks as they were transported across the Russian wilderness. These transfers were as much a death sentence as the labor camps themselves, with prisoners suffocating, freezing, or dying from starvation before even arriving at the Gulag. One of the most gruesome prison moves occurred during the Spanish colonization of the Philippines. The Bataan Death March of 1942 saw over 60,000 Filipino and American prisoners of war forcibly marched over 60 miles by the Japanese military. With little food or water and under the blazing sun, prisoners who collapsed were bayoneted or shot. The march became one of the most infamous war crimes of World War II. The Andersonville prisoner exchange disaster during the American Civil War demonstrated another side of brutal prison transfers. The Confederate-run Andersonville prison was notorious for its horrific conditions, but when a prisoner exchange program fell through, Union captives were relocated in worse conditions. Some were transported in sweltering train cars with no ventilation, leading to mass suffocation and disease outbreaks. Another brutal transfer took place during the Cambodian genocide under the Khmer Rouge. Suspected enemies of the state were rounded up and sent to the infamous Tuol Sleng prison in Phnom Penh. What started as a school was transformed into a nightmarish torture center. Prisoners were taken there under false promises of fair trials, only to be systematically executed or sent to the killing fields for mass slaughter. Prison transfers weren't just about physical suffering, they also broke spirits. One of the most terrifying examples occurred in North Korea's political prison camps. When prisoners were suspected of plotting an escape or defying guards, they and their entire families were relocated to more brutal labor camps. These transfers meant near-certain death, as conditions in these camps were even worse, often involving forced labor in freezing temperatures with virtually no food. In the late 20th century, Robben Island prison transfers in South Africa became infamous for their psychological torment. The apartheid government moved anti-apartheid activists, including Nelson Mandela, to Robben Island, an isolated prison surrounded by shark-infested waters. Prisoners were deliberately placed in solitary confinement or separated from their families for years, breaking their resolve through sheer isolation. One of the cruelest modern-day transfers occurred in Brazil's Carandiru prison massacre in 1992. When a riot broke out, authorities decided to move the most dangerous prisoners. Instead, a brutal police raid left 111 prisoners dead. Survivors were crammed into tiny cells, transferred to even worse conditions, and subjected to systematic abuse as punishment. Even in the United States, prison transfers have been used as punishment. In the Marion Federal Penitentiary lockdown of 1983, after 2 guards were killed, authorities permanently locked down the entire prison, transferring many inmates to maximum security facilities where they were held in 23-hour solitary confinement for years, effectively creating the modern Supermax prison system. In Australia's early days, convict ship transfers were a living nightmare. British prisoners were forcibly relocated to Australia in the 18th and 19th centuries, enduring months-long voyages in overcrowded, disease-ridden ships. Many never made it to shore, dying of scurvy, malnutrition, and violent outbreaks before they ever saw land. More recently, Guantanamo Bay prisoner transfers have been shrouded in controversy. Inmates suspected of terrorism were relocated without trial, often subjected to enhanced interrogation techniques that many human rights organizations classified as torture. The prison's remote location made legal recourse nearly impossible, turning it into a legal black hole. Another terrifying transfer took place in El Salvador's gang crackdown in 2023, where thousands of suspected gang members were transferred to a newly built mega-prison. Footage showed shirtless inmates packed tightly together, kneeling in chains, as heavily armed guards oversaw their transport. The mass transfer was meant to crush gang influence, but critics called it an inhumane display of power. Some prison moves are designed for pure psychological torment. In China, Uyghur Muslims have been forcibly relocated to re-education camps in Xinjiang. Reports indicate that prisoners are transferred in secrecy, blindfolded, and shackled before being subjected to forced labor and indoctrination. Detainees who resist are sent to even harsher facilities with extreme isolation. Another haunting relocation strategy was seen in the Soviet gulags, where prisoners were transferred to labor camps in Siberia under conditions so brutal that many did not survive the journey. Transported in cramped train cars with little food or water, these inmates faced sub-zero temperatures and disease before even arriving at their final destination. Those who made it were forced into grueling labor in mines and logging camps, breaking both their bodies and spirits. During the 1970s and 1980s, South Africa's apartheid government used forced prison moves as a way to silence political dissidents. Nelson Mandela himself was moved multiple times to isolate him from fellow activists. His transfer to Robben Island, a notorious prison surrounded by freezing waters and shark-infested seas, was designed to make escape impossible. Even within Robben Island, he was relocated between different wings to break morale and prevent unity among prisoners. One of the darkest cases of forced prison moves comes from Argentina's Dirty War. Thousands of political prisoners were secretly relocated to clandestine detention centers. Some were eventually moved onto death flights, where they were drugged, shackled, and thrown from aircraft into the ocean. These moves weren't meant for relocation, they were meant for disappearance. The Nazi concentration camps were infamous for their systematic relocation of prisoners. The most feared moves were the ones to extermination camps like Auschwitz. Often deceived into believing they were being transferred for labor, prisoners were packed into cattle cars for days, deprived of food, water, and sanitation. Many died before reaching their final destination. Upon arrival, a chilling selection process determined whether they would be immediately executed or subjected to torturous labor. Modern prison moves also serve strategic purposes in maintaining control over high-profile criminals. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, one of the world's most notorious drug lords, was repeatedly transferred within the Mexican prison system due to his history of elaborate escapes. After escaping twice, he was extradited to the United States, where he was placed in ADX Florence, a supermax prison known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies. There, inmates are moved between cells and restricted from human contact to ensure they have no chance of escape. In North Korea, prisoners are transferred to different forced labor camps for the smallest infractions. Entire families are relocated together in what is known as 3 generations of punishment, ensuring that the sins of one person doom their relatives as well. These moves are often unannounced, with prisoners suddenly taken in the dead of night, leaving their former cellmates to wonder if they have been executed or simply disappeared into the vast network of camps. In the United States, the practice of diesel therapy is used as a form of punishment against certain inmates, particularly political prisoners and high-profile criminals. This method involves continuously transferring prisoners between facilities across the country, often in shackles, with little time to rest or communicate with lawyers or family. The relentless travel serves to disorient and mentally break the inmate, preventing them from settling into a stable routine. The British government once used similar tactics during the height of the Northern Ireland conflict. Irish Republican Army, IRA, prisoners were frequently moved between different prisons to disrupt their coordination and break their will. Many of these inmates, considered political prisoners, were subjected to inhumane treatment, including forced strip searches and solitary confinement. The infamous H-block prisons became a focal point of resistance, leading to hunger strikes that resulted in the deaths of multiple inmates. In China, high-profile political prisoners, including human rights activists, have been transferred between facilities without warning. These moves serve to isolate them from supporters and prevent any organized resistance. Reports indicate that many are moved to secret locations where they are denied access to legal representation or medical care. Some disappear entirely, leaving their families to search for answers that may never come. The United Arab Emirates has been criticized for secretly relocating prisoners to black sites, where they face brutal torture and indefinite detention. Many of these prisoners are political dissidents or suspected terrorists who are never formally charged with crimes. Once moved to these undisclosed locations, they are often cut off from the outside world, with no way to contact their families or seek legal recourse. The psychological effects of forced prison moves can be devastating. Inmates who are frequently transferred suffer from extreme stress, disorientation, and anxiety. The lack of stability prevents them from forming social connections, maintaining legal defenses, or even preserving their mental health. Some prisoners who have endured repeated moves describe the experience as worse than solitary confinement. In Latin America, powerful cartel leaders are often transferred to maximum security prisons in attempts to weaken their influence. However, these moves do not always have the intended effect. In some cases, cartel bosses have continued running operations from behind bars, using bribery and intimidation to control prison staff. Transfers may temporarily disrupt their activities, but they rarely eliminate their power entirely. Throughout history, forced prison moves have been used as tools of oppression, control, and punishment. Whether to break political dissidents, suppress rebellion, or simply isolate dangerous criminals, these transfers serve as a chilling reminder of the power that prison systems wield over the lives of those within them. For many prisoners, the fear of an unannounced transfer looms constantly, a reminder that their suffering can always escalate without warning. Even in democratic nations, prison transfers have been used in ways that raise ethical concerns. Whistleblowers, journalists, and activists imprisoned under controversial charges have been relocated to remote facilities, making it harder for them to receive legal support or media attention. These moves, while justified under bureaucratic policies, often appear to be motivated by a desire to suppress certain voices. The fear of forced relocation is so profound that some inmates go to extreme lengths to resist it. Riots have erupted over the announcement of transfers, with prisoners setting fire to their cells or attacking guards in desperate bids to stay put. In some cases, mass breakouts have occurred during transfers, with inmates overpowering their captors in transit. Some of the most brutal prison moves in history were not about transferring prisoners between facilities, but about marching them to their deaths. The Bataan Death March during World War II saw thousands of American and Filipino POWs forced to march over 60 miles in scorching heat, without food or water. Those who collapsed were executed on the spot. The suffering endured during this forced relocation remains one of the most horrifying episodes of wartime brutality. Prison moves have also been exploited for financial gain. Private prison companies in the U.S. have been accused of transferring inmates to maximize profits, shuffling prisoners between facilities based on contracts rather than necessity. These for-profit transfers often result in inmates being moved far from their families, making visitation nearly impossible. Despite international laws meant to protect prisoners from inhumane treatment, forced relocations remain a weapon of control worldwide. Whether for political, financial, or disciplinary reasons, the ability to move inmates at will ensures that those in power always have the upper hand. As long as prisons exist, so too will the shadowy practice of forced prison moves. They serve as a chilling reminder that, for those behind bars, even a moment of stability is never guaranteed. The next transfer could mean a harsher prison, deeper isolation, or even death. For many inmates, the only certainty is uncertainty itself. History is filled with countless brutal prison moves, each one a stark reminder of humanity's darkest impulses. Whether designed to break the body, the mind, or both, these transfers prove that even outside prison walls, suffering can be just as severe. From medieval dungeons to modern supermax facilities, the brutality of prison moves continues to shape justice systems worldwide. These moves weren't just about incarceration. They were calculated efforts to destroy people before they ever reached their destination. Some never survived the journey. Others lived to tell the tale, forever scarred by the horror they endured. And as long as prisons exist, history suggests that the brutality of these moves is far from over.